Greetings, Audio Avengers. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for insightful and entertaining discussions of Marvel television. We are through 5 of our 6 episodes of Moon Knight, and all I can say is that we are all in need of a bit of processing time with Dr. Harrow or Taweret or the guide of your choice to make sense of it, because we appear to be dealing with at least 3 realities. The Egyptian afterlife plane known as the Duat, the real world with evil Arthur Harrow, and the psychology office with Dr. Harrow, who took the bus to get there. This was a challenging and complex episode, and as per usual, the penultimate episode is the one in which the Marvel series themes are laid most bare, which makes this the perfect time for a final Storycast episode of Moon Knight. I'm your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti. The guides I choose for this journey are none other than our expert Storycast crew.
Good evening. I'm Maeve Adams, professor of English at Manhattan College, where I also direct the Digital Arts and Humanities program.
And I'm Amanda Marcotte, senior political writer at Salon.com, and my avatar is 100% a hippo.
Not a rhinoceros, as long as it's not a rhinoceros.
Not a rhinoceros. I have the cute little ears that flop up and down.
I love it.
Look, Amanda, I gotta know, this episode was about organizing principles of your afterlife. If you were to be found face to face with Taweret, what would the organizing principle of your afterlife be? Where would you be? What would be your psych ward?
Record store.
Excellent choice. Excellent choice. Perhaps Latchkey? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, perhaps Latchkey.
Totally.
But yeah, I mean, obviously I would be sorting through a big pile of records, all with really cool album art that were just different parts of my life and the music that it reminded me of.
Oh, that's actually really
Love
sweet.
that.
Maeve, can you top record store for cool afterlife organizing principles?
I mean, it's not cool, but probably a library. I always find libraries very comforting, and they are deeply organized spaces. Some of my students don't know how to find books in the library. I'm like, it's Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress, and both are excellent systems of organization. So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely where I would be. I love libraries. They make me feel happy.
Now, would it be like microfiche? Or are you talking about like paper? Like, where would you? Because I feel like you've had to go through a lot of both in your time.
It's true, actually. And I kind of hate microfiche machines because they are really hard to navigate. They don't work very well. Everything's always getting jammed inside of them. But I would love an archive, a good literary archive. I'd be here for. That's paper.
So if you're Gen Z, is your afterlife a Google search engine? TikTok?
You know. Damn.
Instagram.
Shout out to all our Gen Z listeners for not quitting the episode right now.
I didn't think it was bad. It's just an organizing system. One could argue that Google is a superior organizing system to the Dewey Decimal system.
Yeah.
No, I definitely think that's probably true. I mean,
it's more complete.
Sorry, I just got attacked by a kitten.
Oh, I'm not sorry. Well, I'm sorry you got hurt, but I'm not sorry that there's an adorable kitten at your feet.
Look, we're going to do what we normally do here on Storycast. First, we're going to get into the episode's theme. This week, Amanda is up to illustrate all of that. And then we will get into related works that tie into that theme and might connect to this episode. And then, in our third and final part, we'll dive deeper into the story, some of the things that maybe didn't work as well as the creators intended, some costuming details, and a return to one of the conversation points from our preview of Moon Knight, the Batman. Mm-hmm. So let's go to the top of that list, gang, and talk about our episode theme. Amanda, what would you say is the primary theme of this episode of Moon Knight?
Justice versus mercy. Or if you really want to think about it, like the problem of justice, the concept of justice, how it's a problem without mercy. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, so I really look forward to digging into it.
How did this episode focus on justice? Or was it did it just come down to the scales and the heart? Because we didn't really get into the morality of Stephen's choices or Mark's choices and whether they were good or bad. You know, how did you see this coming out of this episode?
Well, that's exactly the point, right? Like, one of the problems with justice is it's such a nebulous concept. Like, who are you to judge, really, ultimately? At the end of the day, I think we all have this, like, idea of justice. We don't often look at it too closely and how nebulous a concept it is, and how often we ascribe goodness or badness to people without knowing the full context of why they did what they did, without asking questions about how they got to the place where they were making these decisions, whether or not the worst thing they ever did defines who they are.
Yeah.
Things like that. And I think what was interesting is you guys, especially in Character Cast, were talking a lot about Khonshu versus Amit's kind of life philosophies. And this episode really says they're the same in a lot of ways, right? Yeah, Amit judges them before, Khonshu after. But think about it. They're gods. They might be like, if a god is omniscient, then those two before and after kind of don't really matter.
Yeah.
It's asking, I think, a deeper question about who are you to say who is entirely good and entirely bad. Now, I think judging actions is possible, but I think this episode asks very hard questions, especially nowadays. I think a lot of people, left, right, center, whatever, feel very quick to judge a person's entire being, to render a judgment onto a human being, to put their heart on a scale and say whether they're going to hell or going to the field of reeds, right?
Yeah.
And I think that this episode really questions very hard whether or not we can ever know the soul of another human being and whether they are good or bad.
It also tries to find, I don't know if we want to say middle ground, but it tries to find a space between the idea that there are these abstract conceptions of justice and systems of justice that we just have to kind of have some faith in, right? Like, our justice system, we have to kind of put some faith in the idea that it's doing the right thing when it punishes or chooses not to punish on the one hand. And gods are not that different from that insofar as humans can't fully access the justice of the gods, right? We sort of live in this world and our lives are determined by these things, but we can't fully comprehend. We just are avatars of that conception of justice, for example. So that on the one hand, and then on the far end of the spectrum, you might get something like what we see in the modern world, in the real world, where it is people think that they can take on themselves the right to pass judgment in really totalizing ways. Because there has to be some kind of middle ground between those two things. Like we have to have a sense that they're abstract conceptions of justice that help all of us organize our behavior with respect to one another, and institutions that help preserve those things. And at the same time, also be able to participate in the process of deciding what justice is, right? But we're not all alone, being like, I hate X person because I don't agree with them and now they're dead to me. Right.
And that's where mercy comes in. And I think mercy is a deeply misunderstood concept. It's not the same thing as forgiveness. And I think we can get into that a little bit later. But the quality of mercy is looking at the person that you're sitting in judgment of and staying in the space of, yet you are still a human being. Yet you still have value. Yet I'm going to actually look at who you are in terms of the whole self, the context of what you did, things like that. A judgment without mercy is no justice at all. I think a lot of people would argue. I certainly would argue it. And certainly our legal system validates itself a lot of the time by having mercy. The mercy of the court matters quite a bit. Like a person can throw themselves on the mercy of the court. They can say, I stole that loaf of bread, but my child was starving. Right. I killed that person. It was self-defense. Or, in more nebulous but important ways, I think that make more sense to modern people, which is, Joe Biden just pardoned 2 people that were 100% guilty of their crimes. But they did drug crimes, nonviolent drug crimes. They've lived outstanding lives since then. And the question is, was that it wasn't a just sentence to begin with because it wasn't a merciful one. It was not taking into the context of what they did. It was just mindlessly passing judgment on the whole of a person without thinking of them as a person as potential to be productive in their community. So I think it's so important to think of mercy as a critical component of justice. And I think this episode really looks into that, because you know what Amit and Khonshu have in common? Not merciful gods.
Yeah. And the other thing about mercy that's important in the context of what you're talking about is that mercy presumes that human beings change over time, that we are capable not just of, responding in the moment, for example, right? Mercy can be extended because we killed somebody in self-defense. Mercy can also be extended because we believe that somebody believes that we are capable of changing, right? That's the problem with the 3 strikes you're out system, right? Where there's no presumption that you could possibly change. If you did it 3 times, you must be fundamentally just bad and not worthy of social life. And mercy is sort of the attempt to understand that we are capable. Our lives are complex. Our decisions are complex, and we are capable of change. And I think you're right that that's kind of the antithesis of a God's judgment over a person.
Honestly, this came up a lot during the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearing. Like, these Republicans that were pretending to be super offended by some decisions she'd made in child porn cases. And they were talking about these cases as if it's black and white, always black and white. If there's anything considered child porn on your computer, that's a black and white issue. You are an evil person who should be killed or put in prison forever. End of story. We don't need to know the circumstances. And then you start to actually read the cases that she showed mercy on people, which is very common. Almost all judges do this because, again, the validity of their position depends on such a thing. And you find out it's an 18-year-old kid who was looking at a picture of a 17-year-old kid.
Right.
And it's like, how is that the same thing as pedophilia? It's not. And those sorts of things matter. And I think this episode was asking us some really hard questions about how to consider those kinds of contextual questions.
Right.
Yeah, I'm curious where you saw it, because we don't get Amit at all in this episode, and we get a modest amount of Khonshu towards the end. So of all the episodes, I continue to be surprised that this is the theme that you turn to of all the episodes we've had of Moon Knight. So where in this episode did you see this theme coming to light?
Well, I mean, the whole episode is about Marc his soul being weighed, right? And Marc believes that he is an irredeemable, unforgivable person who deserves no mercy. He's very clear that Khonshu he says at one point when he's talking about all the people that he's killed, that he wished one of them had killed him. And the point of that dialogue is to say, he was told they were irredeemably evil people. He also believes himself to be an irredeemably evil person who would be dead, but if he wasn't being used as a weapon by Khonshu, right? And it's interesting because he isn't an irredeemably bad person. And we find out pretty quickly that sense that he is undeserving of life and forgiveness or mercy goes all the way back to when he was a child, and he made a bad mistake that led to his brother's death, and his mother never forgave him for it. And, her great sin towards her child throughout her life is that she had absolutely no mercy, no understanding that a child could make such a mistake.
Well, the mom is such an interesting character choice to talk about, because to me, she feels like one where I could just absolutely say, this is a 100% horrible, bad person. What would you say to someone who's like, well, a mother who would treat their child like this, and essentially abuse them and blame them and ruin them over, what seemed like a decade's worth of time almost. How is she not just 100% bad and kind of complicating this question of your theme?
I mean, I think that's why this was a really good and challenging episode that doesn't talk down to its viewers, right? The mother, what she does is, I would say, unforgivable. I don't think that any of us can hold it against Marc that he could never forgive her. But she's also shown as somebody who's in deep grief and trauma, right? And that everything she does is flowing from that, not because she's intending to be a cruel person.
Well, and I think this goes back to Amanda's distinction between forgiveness and mercy. That we don't have to forgive to be merciful. And I think maybe some of the difficulty that we might have with defining mercy. And because I don't think that people don't understand the concept. I think it's just really complicated. Because one of the things that gets in the way of our understanding of mercy is that we have these competing systems of justice that have different conceptions of what mercy is. And in religious systems, it's largely about reconciliation. So it's about forgiveness. In the judicial system, it's about extending understanding and attempting to account for context. Those are different things, because the justice system isn't saying that, when Joe Biden pardons these two drug offenders, Joe Biden isn't saying they didn't commit a crime, nor is he saying necessarily we forgive you for doing the thing you did, but that the punishment was disproportionate and not itself just. So the mercy is about rectifying an injustice, about extending understanding rather than forgiveness. And I think that's where the complication comes in, because philosophers for, centuries have debated the concept of what mercy is, or what goodness is, or what justice is, or what decency is. So I don't think it's that people don't understand it, but rather that it's hard to understand. And I think you're right, Amanda, that Marc's mother is an interesting and complicating factor for us, because she makes it hard for us to want to extend mercy to her. I mean, maybe it's impossible, and maybe that's a problem, and maybe we can talk about that. But everybody in this episode, everybody in this show has failed on some grounds, and we have to figure out how to extend understanding to them.
And I definitely am not like the end all be all of defining what mercy is. I think that it's just very complicated for sure. And this episode really deals with it. I think that for me, the scene that's most interesting to unpack, that's most difficult, is him going to her Shiva and just not having the courage to go inside, right?
Yeah.
Because to go inside, and that's really more of a mercy to his father in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Sure.
Is not to say I forgive, which I think is a concept I have a lot of problems with, because it's weaponized against people who haven't had justice a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But you don't have to forgive somebody to go to their funeral. You don't have to forget what they did. It is a small act of mercy sometimes to show up at the funeral of a person that you had a difficult relationship with, or even a hateful one, because it's still, you're not coming to praise them, you're coming to bury them.
Yeah.
And it's to say that, nonetheless, she was my mother, she was a human being, and this remains true despite everything else, right? And I think he was having it ended up being a thing that weighed on his soul and made him fall apart mentally, because he couldn't, I think the grace of showing up at her Shiva would have made him feel better.
Yeah.
And he couldn't do that for himself.
I think I'm picking up what you're putting down with that point in particular, right? This idea that by his inability to extend that mercy, again, we're exempting forgiveness from that. That's when he broke. You're right. And so it makes sense to me that this episode really is trying to address the ways in which the inability to contain that mercy within yourself can also be very destructive, right? That whether or not you are right? Justice at some level is about, righteousness. And Marc is right that his mother was horrible to him. And Marc is right that his father was a limp noodle who did nothing to contain the situation. At the same time, his inability to find the mercy for them, it obviously hurts his father, but it hurts Marc more than anyone.
Yeah, that hate, that bitterness curdles people.
Totally.
And I think finding a way to let go of it without necessarily engaging in these forgiveness rituals is very important for people's mental health.
I think it's great, too, that in the context of sitting Shiva, we have a faith that's fundamentally distinctive from Christianity, where forgiveness is and the idea of an afterlife or reconciliation. There's no afterlife in Judaism, right? So there's no judgment day where some people are just fundamentally good and some people are just fundamentally bad. It's a religion that doesn't operate according to those principles. And so the idea of guilt is totally different. The idea of mercy or grace, because I think grace, you mentioned that a minute ago, Amanda, grace is another variation of the way we think about mercy, but it's different because oftentimes we extend grace to ourselves. So grace is a way of recognizing our mortality and our humanity and the sort of fundamental just feelings of guilt that come along with being a human being, because we are deeply rational and emotional beings at the same time. And so we really feel how we have been in the world. And then we've got these systems that make us feel like we're supposed to see all of those feelings and actions in black and white. And none of it is black and white. And so extending some grace to yourself is a way of extending mercy, but it has a different valence. And I think that's useful for thinking about what you're talking about, that we can extend grace to ourselves. We could extend grace to others, even though we don't forgive them, even if we don't extend mercy to them, right? We kind of maybe may have damning judgments about them in our minds, but there's a way of extending grace that is a pathway to understanding.
And I think the most important storyline through this episode that illustrates all this, of course, is the Stephen and Marc relationship.
Yeah.
Throughout this series, Stephen is presented as being very judgmental and unforgiving towards Marc. He sees him as a murderer. He does not he has a very black and white view of Marc. He kind of just finds him disgusting and hates him.
Yeah.
And at the end of this episode, the thing that causes the sequence of events that leads to Stephen being reconciled into Marc and then becoming kind of a whole complete person again was Stephen looking Marc in the eye and saying, you were a child. It wasn't your fault.
Yeah.
And, again, is that forgiveness? I don't know that it is, because he isn't saying you had anything to be forgiven for. It is absolutely mercy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, since Stephen and Marc are the same person, he was extending it to himself. And I think saying, I'm not a bad person. And that's really important, because in a lot of ways, Marc is still being set up to be a redeemed character. He has a lot of red on the ledger in Black Widow's terms.
Yeah.
But he's also poised to save a lot of people's lives from exactly the kind of black and white judgmentalism, that mentality that he's been trapped in working for Khonshu.
Yeah.
And it is true that Amit does make a sort of background appearance in the sense that we see a bunch of falling stars, which I guess are souls, being like pelted into the sands as Harrow is exacting Amit's judgment. And certainly I can't think of anything less merciful, less graceful than subjecting people to premature murder, essentially because a god has deemed that their future choices are going to be somehow less than.
Right.
Yeah. And that's all they have to offer.
Yeah.
Right. And which sort of you open with talking about the idea that we can just sort of quickly make these judgments between bad and good. And if we've learned anything in the MCU, it's that gods are as flawed as humans when it comes to making these kinds of complex moral decisions.
It's funny that there's that moment where Marc says to Harrow, I like your Ned Flanders mustache. Right? Because, of course, Ned Flanders, being the kind of like devout Christian in The Simpsons, is a perfect kind of embodiment of that sort of God has made decisions and we must just follow them. And whether he extends mercy or not is up to him. And this is nothing we can intervene in. And yeah, that sort of like that God's judgment is always going to be the right judgment and above us.
Boo.
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 Says the three atheists in the room.
Yeah, exactly. So Maeve, let's talk about some related works now to this theme of the problem of justice without mercy or grace. So what would you say is another prominent work of art or literature that also utilizes that idea?
The 19th century novel, here I am, 19th century scholar. I'm going to bring up my 19th century literature. 19th century novel by Thomas Hardy Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which I think I've mentioned very briefly on Storycast before. I don't think I've gone into detail about it, but this is a novel that it's arguably like my favorite novel, maybe top 5. I don't know. It's always hard to say what's a favorite book because there's so many. The novel is a story about a woman who is sexually assaulted, and then the novel tells the story of all the attempts that she makes to kind of put her life back together, and what happens when people find out what has happened to her and how they fail her over and over and over again. And spoiler alert, I'll give you a beat if you want to kind of fast forward. She ends up murdering the person who has raped her at the end of the novel after a lifetime of being destroyed by other men. So she murders him, and she is convicted of the crime and hung for that crime. She's executed. And the very last paragraph of the novel begins by saying, "Justice was done." Justice is in quotation marks. So I think the only scare quotes in the entire novel, and scare quotes aren't really a Victorian thing. So
no,
they're there sometimes, but it's rare. So justice was done in quotes. This idea of justice that's abstract and domineering over human life and lacking in mercy, lacking in grace, and the passive voice there, justice was done. We have no sense of who has done this justice. Obviously, these are magistrates. This is a justice system that has made this choice. We also don't see her dying. We see a black flag go up on a tower that indicates that the execution has been completed. The entire story leading up to this is a story about the fact that this couldn't possibly be justice, because justice would be to understand Tess, to perhaps even grant her mercy on the grounds that this is a kind of self-defense. Yes, late in the game, but he's also forced her to like shack up with him at this point, right? So he's not just raped her early in the novel, but then is the only one who's willing to take the tainted goods of Tess, and is clearly not a good person. We know that, obviously, he's a rapist. But yeah, this is the novel is essentially just the entire thing presses against this final paragraph that is so weirdly written and I think so perfect in the context of thinking about how justice is injustice.
It's also one of my favorite books.
It's so good.
It's so good, and if you've never read it, just read it. It's a beautifully written, very difficult book, but Thomas Hardy's books always are.
Yeah.
The thing about it too is he always ties these concepts into some of his social criticisms of 19th century morality, sexual morality, and a lot of the book is kind of about the absurdity of how a woman is a virgin or not.
Yeah.
And that is also a judgment that is rendered unto the whole of a person, right?
Yeah. Right.
That once you are no longer a virgin, that you are completely condemned for the rest of your life. You are an innocent or a not if you're female, and that is a black and white judgment, even if you were raped. And so much of the book is about kind of really thinking these things through. And it was written in the 19th century.
Yeah, right.
Over 100 years later, we're still grappling with these questions. We still see men raping women and somehow want to make it a judgment on her, not just of her actions, but her entire being.
Right, that she's the one who's supposed to not only pay the price for, in the context of having been raped, but also then pay the price later in terms of this is being fundamentally her responsibility. The novel does that in a really interesting way because the second person, it's the first person that she tells the story to. She actually tells this man who wants to marry her what has happened to her, because he says, I want to know. And he, seems like he's going to be the guy who gets it. His name, by the way, is Angel. I mean, come on. It's like Thomas Hardy's indictments of organized religion are also really on point. but the way the novel sets it up is that Angel convinces her to tell him the story, and the chapter breaks. And the very next chapter is called The Woman Pays, which is, it's this sort of like, I'm just going to tell you exactly how it is. And that's Thomas Hardy, right? His realism is very straightforward while also being very lyrical. I mean, he's a very lyrical novelist, but yeah, The Woman Pays. I mean, we're still doing that. That's exactly what you're talking about.
It seems unsubtle, but read it. There's more subtlety than it.
It's not at all unsubtle. Yeah, that's right.
Well, within the kind of nuance of the way it's written, but more importantly, you have to remember that in the 19th century, a lot of these social criticisms were often buried under just piles of text and innuendo because of censorship and moral outrage and just sort of the kind of repressive climate of the era. Yeah. And so it was very brave of him just to be like two middle fingers in the reader's face like that.
Well, and his critics, the contemporary reviewers, many of them disliked the novel entirely on the grounds that there was something inappropriate about telling this story, that this was an unspeakable truth. And or whether it was a truth or not, it was unspeakable. And that's, to me, there's something here that is relevant to what we're talking about with Moon Knight. The novel sets us up to understand that justice can't be done because the justice system doesn't care to know her whole story. And this episode is entirely about us working through the difficulty of knowing someone's whole and painful, traumatizing, and maybe even a little evil story, that we are not perfect beings. We make horrible mistakes. We have horrible things done unto us. And if a justice system can't extend mercy on the grounds that it could begin to understand all that complexity, that it is not a justice system at all. Justice is not done. Justice was done in some sort of abstract sense. I mean, she's dead, right? She's paid the ultimate price.
Right. The letter of the law has been followed, which is not, is a very, very, very incomplete definition of justice.
Yeah. And even if Khonshu is like, it's fine that I've made my avatar kill a bunch of people because in my head that's justice, that's still not justice, because our reckoning with that problem, the whole story of that involves the feelings of guilt of having murdered people in the name of some abstract conception of justice. So abstractions don't get us anywhere. They only leave us desperately unhappy or miserable or, dead, in the case of both of these stories.
Yeah. Yeah. The scene where Mark is looking at the faces of all the people he's killed is just so profound in that way, which is like you said, we have these abstract notions of justice and we want to believe that when justice is done, it somehow cleans the slate, but it doesn't it just doesn't. Yeah. And unfortunately it creates damage like this. I mean, you think of Tessa the D'Urbervilles, and another layer on that is that her rapist, it's Alec d'Urberville, right?
So it's Alec d'Urberville.
Yeah. Alec d'Urberville is a pretty pure villain. Yeah. And yet the fact that it's up to Tess to exact justice on him doesn't exactly serve her well.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about that, Maeve. Because, one of the things that I think we find in our justice system is that people of means and privilege are the ones to whom this sort of mercy and grace tend to be extended to. So let's talk about Alec then, the rapist in this case. Is the idea that somehow we should be understanding of this rapist in the context of this system of justice that y'all are talking about?
Justice doesn't even apply to him because what he's done is not just or unjust. It's just a thing that happened.
Surely rape is unjust.
Well,
not the rape as he's committed in the book. It's actually an open legal question if it's rape.
Well, legal question is separate from a justice question.
And that's also not
But morally, true. It's 100% rape.
Yeah. And no, it's very clearly non-consensual sex. And in the 19th century, there was a non-consensual sex clause for rape. She falls asleep and he violates her. And we know you can't consent if you're asleep, but also the 19th century knew that you couldn't consent if you were unconscious.
I thought their law said that you had to fight back.
No. There is a conception of rape in the 19th century that includes what happens to Tess.
But it doesn't matter. He's rich, she's poor.
Well, what the novel does to complicate that is that it doesn't tell us the story of his rape, because the world around him, even if there's a law on the books that says this is rape, the world around him doesn't think that justice applies to this problem. Because again, justice is this abstraction, right? And you have a justice system that's there to try to make that abstraction real and grant it parameters that a collective has agreed on. But we know we live in a world, like Marc is saying, where justice doesn't apply to everyone equally. So if you're a rich white guy and you're, screwing over investors, then I don't know, is there a question? Are you doing something wrong? Or maybe you were just trying to get yours because, capitalism. But if you are, a black man selling drugs on the corner, right, to find some way to provide food for your family, that's clearly illegal and you are subject to the laws of the justice system. So we apply justice unequally, even if we have laws that make clear what is right and what is wrong, what is criminal, what is not criminal, etc.
Right. I feel like we're saying the same thing, though. And so that's why I'm still not sure I follow. So
I would say that the thing that the book is definitely arguing is that a system that showed more mercy, that had that just sort of built in, not just the justice system, but the society around it, Alec would not be murdered because Tess would have been married to Angel.
Right.
Tess would be safe and Tess would be happy.
Right.
And she wouldn't be forced into servitude for her rapist. She wouldn't be a forced mistress to him. She wouldn't crack and she wouldn't have killed him. Right. And I think that it's not saying specifically that this guy needs mercy, but just a society that generally has mercy has less violence overall.
And I suppose you could say too, right? I mean, a system of justice that has more mercy might make it easier to hold people accountable, even if they have privilege and power, right? Because, if part of the reason everyone's trying to avoid punishing, that really nice rich kid who just raped that girl one time is because everyone knows that our system is not actually about, reconciling the situation, improving somebody, putting someone through some kind of like process. It's about, horrible, horrible suffering.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. I think that one of the reasons that our horribly long sentences in our justice system are such a problem and we are seeing so many people struggle against them isn't just that they fall disproportionately on the poor, but I think you're right, they accelerate the amount of resources and investment that goes into keeping rich people out of jail in the first place.
And enriching people through the prison system because our prisons are privatized.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We would get a lot further in our society, I think, if justice was swift and sure, but also proportionate.
And here's a problem. So you're exactly right, Amanda, that justice systems legitimate themselves partly through the recognition of the humanity of those that they seek to punish or deciding whether or not to punish. And they do that by extending mercy. But in our system, mercy is a ruse, right? That's one argument, right? One argument is that mercy is a ruse because it's the way that we say, oh, yes. So they are actually fair and proportionate. But when we think about who they're fair and proportionate to, it's people like Brock Turner.
Yeah. That's who I was thinking of.
Yeah. I mean, it's what I was thinking of all day long today, thinking about justice. We live in a world where injustice is perpetrated every day in the name not only of abstraction, but in the name of a system that claims to be merciful. But that mercy is disgusting. I mean, because it's so unequally applied.
The show makes the same observation as Tess of the D'Urbervilles too, about how the failure to show mercy to the vulnerable, to the victims in a lot of these cases tends to put the judgment on the weakest, most vulnerable people in our society disproportionately, ends up causing more violence, ends up causing more crime, because Marc, his problems start when he is a vulnerable child, someone who no one protects. So he's a lot like Tess.
Yeah.
This person that this terrible thing happens to, and he is held solely accountable for it. Yeah. Even though he didn't
it's all your fault, is what his mother
it's all
says.
your fault, which is functionally the message that Tess gets every time she turns around in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. It's all your fault. And he is just like Tess. She is cut out of society. She cannot make a living. She cannot get married. She is stigmatized and ends up becoming the kind of person, a marginalized person whose only options in life to survive are unimaginably terrible. That's also what has happened to Marc. He has become a mercenary because all of these problems led him into a situation where he had no other way to make a living.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to be said for the way that we cause our own problems by not showing mercy to those who need it the most.
Another way to read that is that because he's never been shown mercy, all he knows is violence. All he knows is the kind of violent justice that is not justice. Yeah. It's all he knows, that it's blame, it's black and white, guilty or not guilty, and ultimate punishments versus not being punished at all.
That's so true. And that, it's so interesting that Khonshu sees this guy as a broken mind. He says, right, your mind is fractured. This is basically awesome. And I can totally use you to make these kinds of black and white judgments precisely because what you're saying, Maeve, which is that you have never been shown mercy. Therefore, I'm able to use you as a weapon without it.
Yeah.
So talk to me, Maeve, about some other parallels you noticed between Tess of the D'Urbervilles and this episode.
Hardy's novel never uses the word mercy. And that's not necessarily important, right? This episode of the show doesn't use the word mercy. But I don't think Hardy's novel is actually about mercy per se. And I've been wrestling with this all day long because I think we need to add another term to our conversation. So we've got justice, we've got mercy. I think these are two critical components of our making sense of what this episode does. Hardy's novel is about something in addition to all of this that's mercy would save her life. Mercy from the justices would save her life. Mercy would save Mark Stevens' life. And one of them gets some mercy in a way because the scales have balanced. Right. And there's been a recognition that one of them is deserving of mercy and the other one isn't, in a sense, right? So mercy can save your life when that's on the line. And that's true of our religious conception of mercy. It's true of our judicial conception of mercy. I feel like there is something else that happens when individuals are faced with the complexity of lives, right? So Tess's whole life up until the moment where she doesn't get mercy, up until that moment, she's not asking for mercy. She's asking for, compassion, understanding. I know that she's asking for decency. She's asking for a recognition of her humanity, that she's deserving of love.
I think, yes, but I think that in a lot of ways that concept does cover it in the sense that one of the things that's most remarkable about Tess of the D'Urbervilles to me is it so resembles so much of the debate about rape that's been going on in our lifetime, because she's raped under very similar circumstances to most rape victims now, right? She's at a party. She stays too late. If I recall correctly, she's been drinking.
She's on her way home. It's just really late and she's fallen asleep.
Either way,
in the car. Yeah.
It's allowed people, it creates a space in the Victorian mind. In the Victorian mind, just allowing yourself to be in that situation is reason enough to blame the victim.
Mm-hmm.
And in a modern mind, that is also true. When victims drink too much, or they were dressed a certain way, or they put themselves in a situation that was unsafe, and Tess definitely does this. Again, the book is the book is so front loaded with telling you why she was there, why she stayed too late. Mm-hmm. Every choice she made was understandable, but that is also true of every other rape victim in these circumstances. If you actually listen to them, was it always a perfect set of choices? No, but the lack of mercy towards women for being imperfect in even the slightest way.
Yeah. I do think one of the things that's interesting about the show, which is related to what you're saying about Tess, is that this episode and Tess of the D'Urbervilles is very careful to distinguish between the occasions for justice. So there are occasions for justice that involve higher powers, whether it be gods or courts or somebody else who has more power than you do in the world to grant you a more just experience and to extend mercy to you. Because if mercy can save your life, it might also grant you more life outside, free. It distinguishes between those occasions of justice and other occasions of justice that are intersubjective, between two individuals just trying to understand one another. And it's going to be ironic for all of us, those of you who haven't seen the episode yet, or, if you've just seen it, to remember that Harrow says there's no progress without understanding. And of course, this is Dr. Harrow, right? So it's not the same Harrow that we've been encountering in the rest of the story. This is the Harrow inside their head. But Harrow is saying something that's different from the way that we might understand how gods make decisions about people's afterlives, or justices make decisions about people's lives. And the reason that I think it might be worthwhile adding something, it could be a Venn diagram, right? Like mercy can be on one side, and then whatever we want to put on the other side, whether it's compassion or understanding, seems like too floopy to me. Like it's just sort of a waffly concept. Compassion feels like a little more precise. Maybe even decency feels a little more precise. Like I think there's a Venn diagram, and maybe they nearly like fully intersect with one another. But I think there is something different about what it means when Mark and Stephen see each other's pain and realize that this is one life. And it's one life that the integration of which requires compassion. I mean, it's the word that keeps coming to my mind. And I know that there are probably better ways of describing this, but I want to open up a space for this, some other concept to enter in here that I think is also relevant to Tess.
I liked using the word mercy because it's a fun old fashioned word. Yeah. I think we are stabbing at the same thing, which is seeing a person in the full context of their being, seeing them as a human being, saying maybe an action was bad, but not but a person is not.
Yeah.
And then I think a lot of the time when we think about things in that context, it can actually give us a sense of proportionality. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It makes it, when we say that when we're judging actions, not people.
Yeah.
It makes it a little easier to see that rape is really bad versus staying out too late. It's not that bad.
Yeah. Like, you know what? Right. I just realized that there's actually a way of framing this, I think, right? Like, so what we've said is justice without mercy is not justice. We might also say that mercy without true compassion is not mercy, because when a God decides, I'm going to have mercy on you, or a judge decides, I'm going to have mercy on you, if it's without compassion, all it's doing is maintaining the hierarchy of power that assumes that one person doesn't really totally need to understand the other. They just need to feel like a little identification, right? Like, so what happens when that justice says, Brock Turner, I don't want to ruin your life? Right? To what extent is that judge kind of, and I'm not saying that the judge did the things that Brock Turner did, but to what extent is the judge choosing to identify with Brock Turner over the woman who is violated.
Right.
And
Yeah.
how is that a failure of compassion? So mercy without compassion is in fact not mercy at all. It's just injustice. So there's
Yeah,
this
it's
sort of
arbitrary.
right. We can kind of map
And it goes
this
back
out.
to like Khonshu, right? Like Khonshu took mercy on Mark Spector by saving his life, but he didn't do it with any compassion because he subjected him to trauma after trauma, which Amanda, you were talking about, which is why that room was full of dead people. And he's like, every single one of these was really horrible for me, and I kind of wish they'd killed me instead.
And also to bring it to the Brock Turner, Alec D'Urberville situation, why does Mark get a pass when everyone else gets killed? Because he has a privilege. He is a good assassin. He can be used the same way that often these wealthy criminals get off when people who did lesser crimes but are poorer get off simply because the judge sees them as a person of value.
This is great.
Khonshu sees value in Mark, so he will give him a pass. He will show him quote unquote mercy.
Wow, sure.
That's really good. Yeah, that's right, I think. Because it goes back to the problem of the way that we imagine mercy to prop up systems of authority, to go back to your point earlier, where mercy is used to legitimize a system of justice as a ruse for the way that system of justice is unjust. In those contexts, what we have is an unjust system that is unmerciful. And what we need is a truly compassionate system. But we do live in a world that fundamentally privileges those hierarchies of power wherein mercy is not compassionate and therefore not merciful, therefore not contributing to justice.
If I'm taking anything away from this, it's that the Egyptians actually had it figured out as well as anybody about 3,000 years ago when they were just like, hey, you kind of got to weigh everything and you put it on the scale and you put it next to the feather and it's like, it's complicated. And that's something our modern society does not deal with very well at all.
No.
I really, really, really love that. I know that Moon Knight has been a tough show for a lot of people, but I really love that it is a show. All the Marvel TV shows have really grappled, I think, really intelligently with the problem of the superhero and some of the philosophical / ideological problems that superhero narratives present. And this has been a really good example of one because Mark is somebody who is a superhero and he is getting all the privileges of a superhero, but he knows in his heart that that's wrong. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's true. Like he is not tortured in the and we're going to get to this, the Bruce Wayne way, like he's legitimately tortured by what this superhero experience has been for him.
Yeah.
But I like that the answer that the show lands on is not what unfortunately I think a lot of punitive people on the left do to think of how to make the justice system more equal, which is make everyone pay the most punitive price that we've been dealing out to the most vulnerable, as opposed to finding a way to be less punitive overall to everybody.
And to believe in people's capacity to change, to improve, to be better. The thing that I love about the Marvel shows, even when they're imperfect, because they're not all perfect. They're not all great. Some of them are really great and some of them are good.
Show some mercy. Show some mercy.
Exactly. What I love about the way that they represent these heroes is that they are fundamentally human and they are all, this is what Auden says. It's part of a love poem that the people that we surround ourselves with, those that we love, we recognize that they are mortal, guilty, and to me, the entirely beautiful. There's something really fundamental about recognizing the humanity of other human beings, whether or not they have power or whether or not they have superpowers. And the shows that we've seen over the past year and a bit, I can't believe it's only been a year and a bit. It feels like, what is time in COVID? They're really grappling with the humanity of the superhero. And maybe sometimes that doesn't totally work as well as it could, but that's actually maybe great. Like, let it not work. Let it just be messy, because this is messy. And superhero shows are just way too often so tidy around the edges of the humanity problem.
I do think Marvel, as it's evolved, has maybe not to the extent that DC has by virtue of necessity, in the sense that Peacemaker is the very messiest superhero show of all time.
I love it.
And I love it. But I do think
Same.
Marvel is starting to, continually add facets to the gem of the superhero experience and sort of complicate it and rough it up. But let's move on to part 3, our final part of our final Moon Knight Storycast. Let's dive deeper into the story and some of its elements in detail. Maeve, was there a narrative weak point of the episode that jumped out to you?
Friends. Honestly, I was really struggling with this episode this morning after watching it on the subway to work, because that mom, oh man. She is so bad, guys, so bad. And you know what? I like, there was this tiny piece of me that was like, see, I said the first episode after we watched it, we talked about it, and I said those female characters are thin. And look, Layla is such a great character. This mom is the worst character that Marvel, I think, I'm just going to say it, it's the worst character Marvel has ever written. It is
You're making me feel better for saying such a thing, because you guys have turned me around actually on this episode, which I liked a lot about, but I could not get past this bad mom trope.
Oh, it's so lazy. It's so lazy. And it's so brutally problematic. Like, come on. We made a show called WandaVision that really broke open the superhero narrative. We can do better.
And the mother narrative, right? There's a lot of complex look at motherhood in WandaVision, but here in this episode, it's playing up this incredibly brutal, overdone archetype of, it's all my mother's fault.
We thought we were in 3 dimensions. Like, this is like the 4th dimension of this multiverse, where we've been transported to the 1950s, where every woman who has mental issues must be hysterical, must be insane, must be irredeemable, and needs to be treated for her irredeemable evil that is rooted in her hysteria. I mean, it's like, I said 1950s, it goes to the 19th century. Freud did this too. Women are hysterical and they must be treated by us men. Then we can prop up those institutions that fundamentally fail women and maybe make them a little bit crazy. But then we get this horrible, that's...
Amanda, you look like you disagree with us on how bad this trope was.
I mean, I think it could have been done better, but it's not like they didn't try to root her behavior in a very real and impossible to recover from trauma. Like, losing a child breaks her. I don't think we're meant to see her as a black and white monster. I think we're meant to see her as a person whose capacity for compassion towards her surviving son broke because she lost one. And I don't think I thought it was a little more complicated than that. I think it was a story where we could understand Mark's grief and his anger and his unwillingness to forgive her for this, because she is a child abuser. But at no point are we allowed to be comfortable with the idea that she's just a pure villain. She just comes across as somebody who isn't coping well, which is why I think her husband doesn't leave her.
Yeah. Okay. So
she's walking around with a bottle of alcohol, just guzzling it, obviously self-medicating.
Setting aside the fact that it is extremely unusual for a person who is not a violent person to go through this trauma and then become a completely one-dimensional abuser in the way that this character is. So that setting that aside, I want to ask you about this, Amanda, because it's something Maeve said to me in our text thread when I was like, a bad bomb trope, I'm drowning, is not the trauma of the guilt that Mark would have felt himself for having potentially feeling responsible for the death of his brother have been enough. Maybe the mother contributes to it, but did she have to be this cartoonishly horrible in order to achieve the objectives of the story? Because I don't think so. And when Maeve was like, I mean, honestly, Mark's guilt alone might have been enough to motivate the story. It actually feels to me like that would have been even stronger given what Khonshu did to him and those dead people sitting in that room, right? I mean, come on.
I think so, especially since he's disassociated. So there's a Mark-Steven dynamic. But she was obviously there to be an avatar of what happens to a person when they cannot show mercy, when they have no compassion left, force, and no ability to see somebody for who they are, when they can't even look at a child and see a child, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's what she was there to be. Because the problem with letting Steven be that person is that we like Steven. Steven is fun. Steven is sweet.
Right.
Yeah.
He's not sweet to Mark because they're the same person and he's the part of Mark that can't forgive himself, right? But he's a tough character to pin that all on. I think they definitely wanted to externalize the idea of what it does to a human being to curdle with such hate and anger.
Yeah.
Well, what you said earlier in the episode is what has turned me around the most on my frustration with this point, which is that she is the stand-in for what happens when you have this sort of retribution without compassion or mercy or whatever, right? That she condemns Mark for one mistake is, I think, what you said. And that's right. It was a mistake. And obviously Mark is going to feel terrible for the rest of his life. And his mother does the thing that the whole episode is arguing against. And I think that might be the most generous and I think actually fair interpretation of what they're doing here. Maybe?
I just think that maybe they could have done that better, because what they did is they drew on a fairly tired trope of a crazy woman who is disturbing the family. And this is a trope that we've seen over and over again in film. You either have like the fatal attraction woman who is like lost her mind and is going to ruin a family, or you have a crazy woman, you know, a la Mercy, right? Who's like, I'm crazy and I'm going to disrupt all the ways that we think about domesticity and the family, and I'm going to fuck this man up and disturb patriarchal authority. And that is the tradition of representing the crazy woman in cinema is a tradition typically, and obviously we have outliers for in this canon, but the tradition suggests that crazy women fuck up families, and that's tired. That is a tired trope, and I think they could have done something better. I mean, literally, they could. I don't know. They could do anything. They could have flipped this around and made the dad.
Yeah, but then you have the daddy issues storyline.
No, it's
tough.
Maeve, it's what you texted to me, which is it's that Mark would have felt guilty enough on his own. And I'm not saying the mother couldn't have like said something horrible at the funeral, right? The mother could have done something awful, but she didn't have to become a belt whipping monster.
The belt and the snapping of the belt. Like,
so
my God,
they
let it go.
They definitely overthought the fact that the character has dissociative identity disorder, which is almost always tied to incredible childhood trauma, including abuse. And so...
Right. And often from parental sources. And so then you could argue that their primary mistake was mommy perfect grilling at the, scene before they go in the cave. I mean, if he had always had a terrible mother or had a mother who was much more difficult before this one event.
Or they didn't have to be so literal about DID. They could have...
Well, that's true
totally.
too. Sure.
They could have had her just say one small thing and his own guilt.
And he held on to it. Exactly. His guilt magnifies it.
Right.
But his guilt is really the feeling that's the problem, which is the problem. We know that. It's actually what they've set us up to think about. It's just all of a sudden they toss in this crazy mom where it's like, we didn't need it. And you've basically just trotted out a tired trope that we don't need to hear again.
And his mother always blaming him, and his mother being cold to him, and his mother losing the love for him that she once had. That's the kind of thing that I think people can understand as part of the story, because again, that would be horrible. And it would contribute to this ongoing trauma that he himself feels and extends. It's just taking that next step to her kicking down his door, basically. It's just, I don't know. So I'm with you, Maeve. Like that trope, y'all have walked me off the ledge of that trope, potentially ruining the character as being like the sole motivation for everything that he's done, and then making me feel like I hate all of this. But I still hate that the trope is that essential. This particular extreme iteration of that trope is so essential to his character.
On the plus side, I don't think we're going to see her again. I don't think we'll see her again in the next episode.
She's not going to come out of the sand and grab him by the neck and drag him into the duat.
Which would make perfect sense, Feels very Medea to me,
Yeah, I was surprised it wasn't her. I'm going to be real. I actually thought when that one hand grabbed Marc around the neck and tried to haul him off before Steven knocked it off, I thought it was going to be the mom. And I was like, okay, we're getting into some real shit now. And then it wasn't her. And I was like, damn it.
That would be actually kind of fun. She's kind of zombie-ish in that context. But also, they would just solidify how bad this representation of the mom was.
That's true.
Yeah, it'd be really fucked up.
Well, all right. I really appreciate y'all sort of talking through that trope and Maeve, highlighting that, and also the way that they could have gotten out of that, I think is really helpful. Amanda, let's change gears a little bit and talk about some costuming details that jumped out at you. What did you see in terms of costuming, and why was it important?
So there wasn't a ton on this episode because there's very few characters when you actually think about it. Besides, I guess the parents, but I didn't look too closely at their costumes. But I was struck by the fact that from the very first scenes in the episode, they actually broadcast loud and clear what the end is going to be by having Marc wearing white and Steven wearing black. It basically tells you who's going to end up in the field of reeds and who's going to end up being in the hell dimension.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It doesn't ever go well for the person dressed head to toe in black.
Although there's that one moment where they finally see each other they're on the street and
they're both in black. Yeah,
crying, and they're both in black, which is actually great because actually that might be foreshadowing something coming out of this because they see each other. So Justice doesn't see them. Justice's blind eyes don't see them for all the integrity of their single character, but they've seen each other. I hadn't thought about that.
They're going to a Shiva, so that's why they're wearing black. But also, I think that this is the time that Marc's ability to keep Steven, who's coded as black, in this episode, while Marc is coded as white. Not the races, the colors.
Literal clothing colors. Yeah.
That's when Steven can no longer be gated off from Marc anymore. We see the first time we see Marc wearing black is when Steven, and he can't keep him separate anymore, that they are the same person, that they're bleeding through each other. So I think that was a lot of the significance of that. And it's they have to be able to be distinguished, but I thought it was interesting they went that far with it because Oscar Isaac was so good at playing both characters. They also have different accents. You can tell them apart, and yet it was so important to visually distinguish them. And I think that was classic foreshadowing.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought was pretty fun, and Stephen calls him out for it, was the way that Arthur Harrow was wearing glasses, a fake mustache, and a sweater vest, and had his hair kind of pulled back in this obnoxious hairstyle. And that was so obviously there's going to be insane amount of debate online about whether the Arthur Harrow scene was real or not, or what was real.
Yeah.
I think that the trip to the underworld is what's real in this episode, and everything else is parts of Marc and Steven's fractured mind. I think that the reason that Arthur Harrow is the psychiatrist in his imagination is because first of all, he's a very judgmental psychiatrist. He's not a compassionate one. And so he's the obvious manifestation of what Marc is kind of feeling about himself and the world. And I really thought it was funny the way they dressed him, because to my mind, that was Marc's subconscious saying that he thinks Arthur Harrow is a pretentious dick.
That's so true. You know, it's not costuming, but it is set dressing. If you look in the background, part of the way you know that this Arthur Harrow is definitely some fake dude in Stephen or Marc's mind is that the bookshelves are full of books, one, that go up way too high for a guy with a cane and a limp to be able to get down, and two, there's like nothing on them. It's just like white spines that look nice on the bookshelf, which goes to your point about being a pretentious asshole.
And I mean, that's probably foreshadowing too, because I think what we may find is that Arthur Harrow's belief system has its limits. There will be a hypocrisy exposed in the last episode. That is my prediction here. I think that's a fairly easy one, but they spent a lot of time characterizing Arthur Harrow as somebody that Marc subconsciously sees as full of shit.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, I think judging Arthur Harrow strikes me as the most likely outcome for his character, in that he will himself be prematurely sent packing to the desert sands of the afterlife. For our last question, I want to return to something we talked about in our preview, which I hinted about in our introduction, which is the Batman. Now, Amanda hasn't seen it yet. I've seen it. Maeve, I know you've seen it.
Yep.
We talked about our collective national obsession with telling and retelling and retelling and retelling Batman stories. By far the most rebooted superhero story of the last, 35 years or whatever. Maeve, has watching this series impacted your thoughts at all on whether or why we're always telling that story? And do you think Moon Knight qualifies as a Batman story?
Moon Knight is not a Batman story. It might sound like a bit of a Batman story. And the way that this series has told its story, we don't have the components that some of the comic books do. And I'm not a comic book expert on this, but we don't have the kind of like wealth thing where the wealth sort of drives or resources drive the ability of Steve and Marc to carry out justice in the way that they do or don't. So it's not a Batman story on those grounds at all. And it doesn't even seem to be trying to emulate that. But even more importantly, because of the way Amanda's framing of this around justice and mercy, and us trying to kind of work out the relationship between justice and mercy and something like compassion, that's not the Batman story at all. The Batman story is a story of justice largely without mercy. It's a justice that is just executed because we've got a Batman who believes that he has a conception of justice, a fundamentally abstract conception of justice that he just metes out. Thankfully, he's in a world that is very black and white on who is good and who is bad, even though he does some things that are fucked up and disregards, civilian casualties, not all the time, but a lot of the time. His theory of justice is one that is fundamentally without mercy, and it's also without compassion. It doesn't actually, and yes, the story justifies that, kind of affirms that by way of its villains. Its villains are so black and white, so bad, right? There's no gray area. I mean, I know that people love this new Batman movie, and I get it, right? My students love it. I have a lot of friends who really love it, but Marc and Amanda know, because I was texting them the entire time I was watching it, that this feels to me like if this were like a good movie, it would be a Catwoman movie with like accidentally a bunch of ads for Batman. I was like, stop advertising Batman in this movie. Just make it a Catwoman movie. Because otherwise what we have is like a brooding, like late teenager, second stage adolescent guy who just essentially carries out the quote unquote mission of Batman. And it fundamentally kind of captures the way in which the Batman story is not about compassion or mercy. It's just about this totally abstract conception of justice that requires no rationalization. He doesn't have to explain anything. He just literally does stuff and then doesn't say much about it.
Right. Everyone in that movie has no compassion or mercy. The Riddler has no compassion or mercy. Batman honestly has no compassion or mercy. I don't even think Catwoman has much compassion or mercy other than for her like a one friend. And, obviously nobody else in the movie does either. We have not talked about it since I have seen the movie. Maeve, I actually also liked this Batman.
Oh, God. Oh, my God.
I will say this. I think it has a lot of problems, and I actually think it highlights both the problems of the sort of Batman as it is consistently being told over the last 30 years, and also the limitations of Moon Knight as a series because of this fundamental dichotomy. DC tells stories in these modern movies about the world we fear, right? The world we are terrified of. Yes. And Gotham is always at the heart of this. It is irredeemably corrupt. It is utterly hopeless, right? We are past the point of any redemption whatsoever. And within that context, if you accept that framing, this Batman story is kind of an interesting story. At the same time, Marvel tells stories about the world we hope for. A fundamentally optimistic look at both human nature and also the direction in which we are progressing. It does not say there are not bad people doing bad things and that bad things happen. It's just that the world is fundamentally positive. And that is partly why some of the stuff Moon Knight wanted to do with its tone over the course of the series didn't really work for me, because it could not entirely separate from that tone and style of like what constitutes an MCU show. And it's why I think Ms. Marvel is going to feel way more at home in the MCU than Moon Knight does.
That said, I think I like Moon Knight, I think, more than you, because I think we can really see the impact of Black Panther and what a great villain Killmonger was on the rest of the MCU. And this is a really good example. So I think at this point, we can fold in the idea that MCU is actually really improved by having, like, the biggest problem with MCU products was always the villain problem. The villain is dumb. The villain is boring, blah, blah, blah. Best villains are the ones that are like Killmonger, that have a point of view that may not necessarily be that different from the hero a lot of the time, that end up setting up conflicts that become moral, philosophical conflicts that invite discussions like this. And I think, Arthur Harrow is a great villain because he believes in what he's doing. I think, again, we're going to see some hypocrisies, but I don't think, unless they fumble the ball, I think we're never going to see Arthur not believing in his cause. I think he does.
I also want to push back a little bit, Mark, on this idea of the way that Marvel represents the universe versus Batman, because I think you're right that when we get Ms. Marvel, we're going to get a world that we recognize. But I think we've been in a world that we recognize. For the most part, this is kind of realism with a twist. The world that we have in front of us has sort of magical elements. We might call it magical realism, but it's not quite like that, right? There's a real world out there that we can all see and recognize. We're like, oh yeah, that looks like London, or that looks like small town America. That looks like New Jersey. I mean, it's New Jersey. But Batman, when we watch Batman, we're like, oh yes, it's Gotham and it's kind of New York. But I think that's we all have lived in New York or live in New York. People who've never lived in New York, who think that New York is like a cesspool of sin and vice, are like, yeah, totally. That's exactly
just
kind of
the
like
best
New York.
parts
it's just
of
like
it.
An extension, right? Exactly. Thank you. It's an extension, right? Like people are like, oh yeah, so Gotham is like an extension of New York City, just like a souped up version of it. It's like, no. This city doesn't look anything like that, and nobody behaves that way.
That's my
and I know
point.
you're not
If you're making
that.
my point for me.
No. But what I want to push back on is not. It's a minor. It's a twist. It's a push in a different direction. Is that the idea that the Marvel universe and the TV shows in particular are hopeful? I don't think they're hopeful. I think they're realistic and optimistic at the same time. There's a kind of realism to them that is grounded in the stuff that makes our lives hard. that makes our lives difficult, that makes our lives painful, that makes it hard to connect with other humans and understand the complexity of the choices that we make, right? There's no complexity in Batman to the choices that Batman makes. There's complexity elsewhere, but it's not in the good and the bad. The good and the bad are uncomplex. And that lack of complexity is a thing that really, I think, hampers some of the versions of the Batman story from doing something really thoughtful about the world that we live in. Because I think some of those movies are great. And I'll rewatch this one.
I don't know why. I mean, you really hated it, and I get it. But I would say this. I mean, you're making a good point about Marvel maybe being more complex, and that is inherently more compelling as a story playground. So I will definitely concede that point. What I will say, though, is people feel about the world now in the sort of haze of the pandemic and the climate change stuff and the increasing inequality and runaway inflation and supply chain problems and everything else, right? Like Joe Manchin and all this other shit that's going on.
Yeah.
People, part of them feels, and then this is why I said the world that we fear is that we are headed towards the Batman universe. And within that context, that story...
Well, you should be worried about that.
To me in the bones a little bit
because
more.
It gets back to what Maeve was saying about neoliberalism, but it's even worse. It's like the critique that Batman tends to fascism comes in place with that. Because what happens when people think the world is irredeemably corrupt is, Russia, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you there's really good writing on this, but the typical Russian citizen thinks that democracy has failed, that politics is gross. They try to not think about politics at all because they think it's impossible to solve problems through politics because all politics is irredeemably corrupt.
Right.
And so they check out. And when people check out and instead turn to strongman leaders like Vladimir Putin or Bruce Wayne or what the fuck ever to solve all their problems through sheer violence and force.
Keep going.
That's what you have. You have fascism.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, you're exactly
Whereas,
right.
Whatever, people may think that the Marvel universe is too brightly colored and optimistic, but you need to have hope in order to have democracy. Because without it, people give up and they find anything to do but stand in the way of fascists.
And hope is aspirational, right? We have to believe that there is a future that is good. And I will say this, there's a huge difference between my students 10 years ago and my students now. My students 10 years ago would regularly say things like, I don't get involved in politics. And I had this whole thing I would do with them where I would get them to sort of understand that an apolitical position was a political position because it supports the status quo, right? So I had this whole thing that I developed over time, a thing that I no longer get to use because my students now are political beings. They may not agree with me. We may have fundamentally kind of orthogonal ways of looking at the universe, but they see themselves as political beings who are invested in political positions. And I will say, I feel kind of hopeful. I'm an optimist by heart, but I feel kind of hopeful because a lot of them fundamentally believe that the system is broken. How they want to fix it, that's diversified, and they're still working on it because they're 18, 19, 20 years old.
Sure.
And that's great. And I think we should all see ourselves as continuing to work on how to fix the problem. But they are not only political, but they also believe that there is something that they could do, that we need to do, even when they're scared, even when they're frustrated. They believe they can make a difference. And that is, I think, I also believe that Gen Xers were fundamentally kind of hopeful. We believed that we could make a difference, maybe for the wrong reasons, because everybody had told us that we could be president, and not all of us can be president, as it turns out. But there is something, I think, good about that the belief that you are a political animal and that you can be aspirational and hopeful is something that I think is different from a universe that looks at Batman and says, we're heading there, and that's all we've got.
I'll just bring it back around to the top of the show. I would say that this is where Moon Knight has a lot in common with the rest of Marvel, which is it's still going to fundamentally be a story about how, no matter how bad Mark Spector fucked up, how many bad choices he's made in his life, he can still be a hero.
Yes.
There's still a potential, and that's a corny narrative, but it's a popular one. It continues to be a popular one, and I'm glad that it is because it's what we all need to believe. Because
agree.
I think that not just for ourselves, but for our society, we have fucked up. We can be better.
Yeah, hey, I mean, Darth Vader throws the Emperor down the chute at the end of Return of the Jedi and gets his Jedi afterlife. So if Darth Vader can be saved, motherfucker, we can all be redeemed, I suppose. One thing I think we can all also agree on is if you haven't seen the Adam West cut of the Batman trailer, I highly recommend you get out there and watch that because that was disturbing and charming as hell. Okay, look, if people want to talk to us about justice, mercy, compassion, Batman, complexity, the Marvel Universe versus DC, Maeve, where can people find and follow you?
I can't believe I'm going to say this, but at Maeve Adams on Twitter. I don't know.
Yeah, Elon Musk's new house. Great. I love that you guys are hanging out. It makes total sense.
Come on
that
over.
You, Bruce Wayne's biggest fan, would be all about Twitter.
Come find and follow me on Twitter. You can also, I teach at Manhattan College. You can find me on their website and send me an email.
Enroll your ass at Manhattan College. That's how you can talk to Maeve Adams.
That's right.
Amanda, where can people find and follow you if they want to talk to you about your many and sundry opinions about Tessa the D'Urbervilles or justice?
I hate Twitter. Twitter should die. But for now, you can find me on Twitter because we're all trapped in the Matrix together. Yeah, maybe Elon Musk will free us, and at that point you can send a raven. But until then, at Amanda Marcotte on Twitter.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to free us. I think there's a much more likely chance that his, hogwash purchase falls apart in the next 3 months. Let's
I know.
That'd be fun to watch.
For that. Yeah, I'd be into that. I'd like it. Especially because he's targeting the people who are dare to do content moderation by name less than 24 hours after the announcement.
That, in a sense, that will long-term free us because it will make Twitter unusable.
Yeah. It's why? Turning Twitter into Truth Social as a move when you've just invested $44 billion.
We are all preemptively free from Truth Social.
God damn it. Scrim as hell. See, Batman was right. No, I'm just kidding.
Nope.
All right, legendary listeners, that's our show for today. We will be back next week with Character Cast to wrap up this season of Moon Knight. Please consider giving us a follow on any of our social media platforms at Marvelous TV Club Facebook page, Twitter page, Instagram page, and leave us one of those Apple rankings if you're on that platform. Those reviews help us rise in search rankings, not just there, but in Google and everywhere else. So that would mean so much to us. And of course, you can follow me at Twitter at Marc Faletti. That's Mark with a C, F as in Frank, Aletti. Fuck you, Elon Musk. All right, gang, let's put on some sweater vests and get into the office on time, shall we? Oakley dokley.